Welcome, everyone, to our session, Beyond the Stitch, Architecting the Next Generation of Programmatic CTV. That's a mouthful. I'm Alex. I am responsible for our monetization and origin server / packaging products on Elemental. So that's specifically AWS Elemental Media Tailor and Media Package. And David?
Yes, I'm David LaPalomento, not actually Irish. I'm the GM for streaming and CTV at JWX.
Cool. So I think we'll probably just get started. I wanted to maybe zoom out a little bit and rewind to 2017 to when we first built Media Tailor and when we first launched, in fact, the media services on AWS. This is shortly after Elemental, this small encoding company, was bought by AWS in 2016. We spent a year building services, taking their hardware and software products and re-architecting them, rebuilding them for the cloud. And one of the first sort of services that we built was Media Tailor, which is a server-side and insertion service. And so back in 2017, one of the first things that we cared about back then when streaming and ad-supported streaming was still kind of in its nascency was device reach. Device reach was the most important problem to solve. This was whether, can you get video and ads playing flawlessly on a 2016 Samsung Tizen TV or a 2018, LG WebOS TV, and solving all the nuances around HLS, discontinuities, and multi-period dash gaps. That was our number one mission. This is now very much a solved problem. And we then fast forward a few years to when streaming is really, especially ad-supported streaming, has really taken off. And you have customers around the world now acquiring exclusive live events like the Olympics, like UEFA and FIFA that are streaming only, or NFL playoffs here in the United States, where streaming audiences are now numbering in the multi-millions compared to before 2020. And at this point in time, it all became about scale and specifically being able to architect your end-to-end video stack and ad stack for the surge in audiences that were previously unexpected and unanticipated in streaming. And specifically being able to scale not only your video tech stack, but also the partner tech stack. So in ad tech, as you may know, there's many, many DSPs, SSPs, ad servers that may all be brittle and may all suffer under especially unexpected live streaming load. And so we work with those partners, we work with those customers to solve that problem. That's very much now also a solved problem. And then finally, in the last few years, I think it's important, once you've achieved scale, once you've achieved the problem of device reach, now you need to make sure that all the impressions, the ad impressions that you're serving, are making it to the right place at the right time and in a really resilient and fault-tolerant way. So streaming, millions to millions of users and showing them hundreds of millions of ads is pointless if the impressions don't make it to third-party measurement systems. So these third-party measurement systems are the combination of measurement providers like Moat and Double Verify and then IAS, as well as even DSPs and SSPs that are responsible for reconciling impressions. And so we built capabilities like prefetch. We built capabilities. We have a new microservice that allows us to retry impressions, in-queue them, and essentially abide by request rate limits that our partners impose on us. So for example, if IAS or Double Verify tells us we can only handle 30,000 requests per second, we can modulate our system to stay below 30,000 requests per second when beaconing impressions to that system. And in the real world, this has helped save some of our customers potentially millions of dollars per month in recoverable missed impressions. So that's now also a solved problem. And now transition to 2026 to today. I think now advertisers and your ad ops teams on the publisher side are no longer asking about, can I reach the right audience? It's more about, how do I maximize revenue for the audience I'm already reaching? How do I maximize my CPMs? How do I improve fill rates? And so to solve that problem, we are very soon after NAB launching a new layer, a programmable layer called Media Tailor Functions, which essentially allows you to write custom scripts and inject business logic before an ad request, after an ad response, or when the session starts. So that allows you to do stuff like, insert contextual signals that are important for the stream. Do things like look up identity of the audience and look up audience segments. Do things like canvas and acquire brand suitability and brand safety signals, if it's especially for a news or potentially objectionable content. But in order to leverage all of that, we need partners and we need customers that can build on top of that foundational scripting layer. Because at the end of the day, your ad ops teams, they don't care about whether or not, they ultimately care about how do I improve my $12 CPM to a $20 CPM. And to do that, it's all about passing the right signals. It's all about passing the right data. It's not about scale. It's not about reach anymore. And so we think that in order to fulfill that mission of increasing your CPMs, of increasing fill rates from industry standards of 60% or so fast to 90% plus, requires us to leverage the right partners to build that foundational layer, to innovate on top of that foundational layer, to build things that your ad ops team truly cares about. And I think that's where partners like David and JWX comes in, and would love to hear your side of the story, David.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, there are a whole bunch of solved problems these days in server-side ad insertion, and we are moving on to the next frontier. I remember when we started looking into CTV monetization, it was way back in 2020. So you guys have been at it for 3 years. I went around and talked to some former colleagues, some folks who had been involved in the first offerings to do server-side ad insertion out in the wild, like at Unicorn Media and Bright Cove and Mux, and I think some of them might even be at AWS these days. And I asked them, how long does it take to build a stitching engine that works? What would you have to do? And all of them roughly said, hey, you need a team of deep video experts who also know monetization in the advertising space. And if you gave them a year, maybe they'd have a flimsy MVP.
Mm-hmm.
So we decided not to do that, right? We decided that we were going to build our server-side ad insertion offering, JWX SSAI, on top of Media Tailor. And we built it kind of with that objective in mind. The goal was speed, right? We need to be fast because the CTV landscape is already being carved up, right? In 2020. Today, it is way faster and the competition is more fierce. So it is not, starting from scratch is a crazy idea. And we're already moving on to how can we move faster on top of the new layer of tools we have. So one thing, if you'll forgive me a diversion, that came up recently is Anthropic had Claude build a compiler for the C language that could compile the Linux kernel. And it did it totally autonomously, right? It did it without no human intervention. There was no engineers who reviewed the code. The project lead had an analysis of how that actually worked, how it did it in practice. And it's really worth reading closely if you haven't checked it out. So yes, the models are getting faster. They're getting better. That was important. And yes, there's some details to orchestrate them so that you can do a good job. But the key element, the key truth that they learned in the pursuit of this goal was that the way to do it was to have a large, comprehensive, and fast test suite that you could run. And that was possible because the C language itself has a huge spec and a huge set of tests that you can run automatically. That was the secret. It wasn't all of the model capabilities. It wasn't some special fancy orchestration. It was the fact that they could put hundreds of Claudes. They could run tons of experiments on top of a code base and immediately get feedback. So it's about parallelism. It's about lots of feedback. It's about clear signals. And so the question I have for everybody out there is do you have that in your ad stack today? Could you even imagine doing something like that? That's kind of the challenge that we are trying to work on at JWX with our server-side ad insertion solution. And it's it's not building a C language compiler. It's harder than that. It's harder than that because it is video, and that's kind of hard. And it's monetization, and that's also hard. But if you shift your perspective a little bit, we've been trying to do that ourselves. There are a lot of parallels. And so I kind of want to talk about that and how you might imagine like a test harness for video monetization might work out in practice. So I'm going to break it down. So video monetization, video engagement, measuring that, building a test harness for that is very difficult, right? So we can do it in the aggregate. Like we certainly can get good measurements over broad swaths of the population. If you're screwing it up over time, it becomes very obvious that you're messing it up. But if you want to write a unit test, if you want to write automation to make sure that viewers will be engaged, like that's just not possible. It is not a thing that you can do. Measuring monetization, quantifying how that works, that's tricky too, right? It would be like great if we could talk to some committee and they would put some equations together that fully specified how CPM and fill rate work. Like maybe we should go to the IAB with that. I don't know. But I don't think that's like realistic, right? That's not going to happen. So in the real world, we have to figure out what the variables are. And the thing about the advertising ecosystem is it's large, it's complex, but it's also reactive, right? So it isn't it's not a target that you can hit. It's moving. Some elements of how it works take like weeks to propagate. So like one thing, we've talked to a bunch of media companies out there, I know happens in the wild is they will have a test that they want to run and they'll just get an engineer to like toggle a query parameter and then like wait a couple weeks and, see what happened. So if you're doing that, if that sounds familiar, like don't be embarrassed. I think everybody's doing it. But that's not a good use of an engineer's time. It's not a good use of analyst, a product manager, whoever. 100x engineers do not toggle query parameters. So that's a challenge that has to be solved if we think about having like a real test harness for video monetization. So what we realize is when you take those two things together is that you do need to shift your perspective. You need to accept that it's going to look a little different than something you would do for a C compiler, right? We're going to have to fall back on that, last resort. Nobody likes it when dealing with the real world statistics, right? We're going to have to use all of the data that we have operating big streaming services and use those to let those be the thousands of experiments, the thousands of data points, all the samples, if you'll forgive me the pun, that we use to drive the optimization of the system. So those are the ingredients, right? You need to have all the data on engagement from your viewers. You need to have all the data from your ad systems. You need to be able to run hundreds of experiments simultaneously, and you probably need to be able to segment them by like demographic, by geography, by timing, by platform. And then like really importantly, you need to be able to put some guardrails up to constrain the damage you could potentially do because we're testing in the real world. That's the only way we're going to make it work.
I think the testing barrier really resonates with me because we've had, I think just a few weeks ago, there was a customer that was trying to implement a real world test of, there's these, audience signal, providers, like identity resolution providers called LiveRamp. So they were trying to test the efficacy of LiveRamp IDs versus like Unified ID 2.0, which is a more like standardized ID. And in order to do this, they had to deploy changes to their player in order to do so. And then they made a mistake in the deployment, and some query parameter, some setting was set incorrectly. So there was a rollback, another redeploy, republish to the App Store, wait for certain viewers to download. So this entire test cycle took about 2 months of back and forth of just manipulating query parameters and just waiting for deploys and wrangling with the App Store, all to test whether or not one ID is slightly more effective than the other ID.
I mean, that's like the ultimate nightmare. Yeah. If you were waiting on App Store submissions to find out that information, like it just it's impossible. So if those are the boundaries of the problem, like there's some consequences to that. Like you can't build it in your app. If you build it in your app, you run into submission delays. And also it doesn't have all the data. You can fiddle with the query parameters, but you're missing a lot of that information that you have back in the rest of your service. It's hard to build it into your ad server because then that only has half the problem, right? And you're streaming the rest of the data along to a system that's not really designed to handle that. What you realize is there's only one place to do it, right? And it's on top of the Stitcher. It's on top of Media Tailor. That's the only place it could possibly live that has all of that control and the ability to make that decision. So that's what we kind of been building. Inside of JWX SSAI, we have a feature that we're calling SSAI strategies. And the idea is it's a clean, simple API that lets you define experiments, lets you segment your audience, lets you run tests, and have that automatically flow through all of the decisions that your server-side ad insertion system is making, right? It has a nice, clean, and simple interface, so you can give it to your ad ops team. You don't have to have a whole bunch of engineers running it, which I think is really nice. I mean, I consider myself an engineer, but I don't mind having a nice web app and not having to go to an API doc all the time. And the other thing, it does have a clean API that is at the right level of abstraction so that you could go grab Claude, grab your frontier model of choice, and have it operate on, have it build experiments, have it look at the results, have it run that in practice.
Yeah, I think what you're saying about being able to run these experiments on the Stitcher, it really resonates with me, and not just because I operate the Stitcher, but also because I think if you look at the architecture and the request flow of your video streams, the Stitcher is the last thing that touches the video before it goes out to the viewer, and it's the last thing that synthesizes your ad tech decisioning stack before it goes out to the viewer, right? It's the last thing that it sits somewhere between ad tech and video tech. And as a result, you can run really cool experiments that sort of touch on both worlds. Not just pure ad tech experiments are the experiment I just referenced earlier about, live ramp IDs versus unified ID. That's a ad tech experiment. But you can run sort of viewer plus ad tech experiments on the Stitcher, does, inserting more ads for a specific session for a specific viewer, does it impact their ability? Does it impact attrition rates for that viewer? How do you balance, for example, ad load for viewers versus lifetime value of the viewer because they leave your platform because you're showing too many ads? So running those experiments and running them at scale is only possible when you're, operating at the intersection of video and ads.
Yeah. And then, we're going to talk about it a little bit later, but we have a customer who is doing exactly that and thinking about the life cycle of their audience and how that impacts the revenue opportunities and stickiness and the kind of ads that they should be showing to those viewers. So It's really cool. The other thing that's going on that I think we have tried to ignore for a long time in this particular space is that you need the ability to do real-time decisioning everywhere in order to actually make this work in practice. And traditional server-side ad insertion does not have that capability, right? All the stitches happen right up front, right when the viewer starts the session. And yes, your pre-roll is kind of real-time, but after that, everything is operating on a lag. And that does have significant consequences, especially when you think about all of the demand partners that you are working with out there in the real world. So when you are putting up a whole bunch of inventory that may or may not actually be shown to end users, it makes your pacing a little bit harder. It may make it more complicated for you to schedule out your demand over time. But the really important thing is you're interacting with all of these systems that are reacting back to you, right? And it may take a little while, but if you are regularly seen as an unreliable source of inventory, that's going to get fed back into the algorithms that the DSPs are working with. It's going to affect your bid density. It's going to lower your fill rate and CPM. You're going to have real significant impact on your business. So the ability to have more confidence that an insertion turns into an impression, really important, right? Now, the good news is server-guided ad insertion really solves this problem. And Media Tailor has awesome support for server-guided ad insertion today. It's available, right? There's a whole bunch of devices where that it is baked in. On a lot of them, there's really great libraries that you can pull in to do it. The only issue is there are a lot of platforms where you don't control the player. You don't control the platform. Or it's a really old device like a 2017 Tizen, and nobody wants to touch that app. Nobody wants to touch it. And we're not even sure if it's like viable to put something that complicated on the system in general. In that situation, we have developed a solution that we call just-in-time ad insertion, or JIT ad insertion. And it works on top of MediaTailor, on top of the traditional VOD workflow. It'll inject a redirect over all of the ad pods in the manifest for viewers, so that when the viewer is buffering towards the ad pod, that is the moment where actually we go out to MediaTailor, the stitch is performed, the auction happens, real-time decisioning, sophistication, magic goes on, and you get back the ability to do this like real-time ad insertion for your VOD workflow, whether it's your pre-roll or it's an hour into a movie. So that's very exciting. I mean, you combine the two, you have JIT ad insertion, which gives you that ability, like server-guided ad insertion everywhere on the long tail of devices out there. And then you have SSAI strategies to be able to build this framework of decisions and intelligence, and possibly even autonomous video monetization on top of MediaTailor, on top of JWX SSAI.
Great. Yeah, and I think maybe bringing this all together, it's I can think of at least a few customers in my wheelhouse where that has embarked on this very similar journey of, starting with reach, then doubling down on scale, then resiliency becomes a hot topic of the day, and then finally transitioning to yield optimization, getting the right signals, and running experiments at scale and doubling down on experiments that work, and quickly abandoning experiments that don't. So, like, for example, there's a paid TV operator we've been working with for 7 or 8 years. When they first started on AWS and on MediaTailor, it was all about transitioning from paid TV to streaming, and they wanted to add an ads tier, and they had to reach all these like legacy set-top boxes and like other CTV devices, and it was about solving multi-period dash problems. Lots of problems we solved with them in the first few years. Then they became successful, and they acquired exclusive sports rights, and they started signing up more for more sporting events. And they ended up running, I think, about 400 or 500 events per week, and sometimes 30 to 40 events simultaneously on the weekend. So then it became about scale, and scale both horizontally, scaling to the number of events, as well as scaling vertically to a number of viewers per event. And they work with many programmatic partners that don't scale well, and programmatic ecosystems can be brittle, where things like render rates and impression to insertion conversion rates are super important. Things like pacing is really important. And in this case, it's more about these programmatic partners were seeing scale surges from zero audience requests to 500,000 requests per second, and so they weren't able to handle that. They've tipped over, or they gave essentially no bid responses back. And so ad fill rates were low. They were suffering 70% or so ad fill rates before we worked with them and co-built really complex prefetching strategies where we can sort of, for known ad breaks ahead of time, we can prefetch based on schedule. For unknown ad breaks, we can automatically prefetch and sort of abide by a specific request rate contract that their SSP or DSP imposed. So like if their SSP says only 10,000 requests per second is what we can handle, we'll try to maintain that ceiling. So that's what we solved with them. And now the next phase of their growth, we're now talking to them about things like how do we incorporate more audience signals? How do we incorporate more contextual signals, especially around for live news where there's negative sentiment and negative context happening in the news, and you want advertisers to still be able to reasonably advertise against potentially negative sentiment. We're talking about things like L-band, double box, and different ad formats. And how do you experiment with these different ad formats and figure out what works and what doesn't? So it very much echoes sort of the streaming journey and ad-supported journey that we're on.
Yeah, it's really just kind of interesting because I think we both were through the compatibility portion of this and the scale portion of the problem. And the transition happened like really quickly. I think it's gone from like, can we do it, to like, okay, now we need to optimize. Now we need to figure out how to make this thing work as effectively as all the old systems we have had in the past.
Yeah. And like just I think to everyone's credit, even the biggest streamers out there like Netflix have not solved the ads problem effectively. There are ad supported tiers on Netflix today, but I think their efficiency and sort of fill rates per break are abysmal compared to the industry.
Yeah, and there's just huge space for optimization. So like that to me is a big opportunity. We have one customer that we've been working with for years since the launch of their AVOD service. They've gone from like 0 to like 3 billion impressions annually. And for them, like they are using SSAI strategies right now to do that kind of testing that we talked about earlier, right? They have a bunch of new users coming into the service. They don't have demographics information. They don't have a profile build up. They don't have interests. Like, why would they show a huge ad load of low value ads to them, to somebody who has not even decided whether the service is interesting, whether they like the content, right? So they're playing around with that and seeing how stickiness of that audience really mixes, how those two variables play off with the revenue that they're able to build out of it. And they were also the first customer that we had that deployed that just-in-time JIT ad insertion broadly, right? So in doing that, they went from a ratio of insertions to impressions, their render rate, from 40 to 95%. It was a really big shift. And while that was happening, their cost per impression went down 55%. So that's a big deal. They were able to deploy it out to all those old devices because they had the confidence of SSAI strategies, and they were able to do A/B testing, and they were able to see the results and do it over time. So it ended up being like a really effective combination for them. So
I think both these journeys really resonate and sort of underpin what we've been talking about around the evolution of CTV, evolution of ad-supported CTV.
Yeah. Well, and there are a lot of really cool demos of AI out here on the floor today. I was just over and watching somebody do an generated AI video demo. Yeah. Very cool. I kind of think though that this space that we are in, because it is very programmatic, because it has clear feedback and is less subjective, like the era of like human optimizing your ad operations, it's going to be outcompeted very soon by AI. I really just like have no doubt. And so like my question to all of you, looking at like a year ago where AI was and today, is like, do you want to wait and find out how that works? So anyways, my email address is dlp@jwx.com. If any of you want to send me a URL to some of your content, I will send you back a demo of JIT ad insertion on top of it using Media Tailor under the hood, and an invite to check out SSAI and SSAI strategies, and love to chat with you about it. If you have more questions, and actually speaking of questions, we still have a couple minutes. We could take some questions from the audience. If you have any. Yeah, I can repeat your question. That's cool. So the question was, is this just about connected TV, or is it being used on other devices where maybe you do have better information? And I think the answer is like, yeah, for sure. I don't know, Alex, if you want to add on to that a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, I mean, our customers, they like, I think device reach is a very important problem for your traditional broadcasters, and is even for your sort of born in the cloud native streamers like Netflix and Prime Video. Like, it's all about device reach. Like Prime Video, for example, still supports smooth streaming devices like from 15 years ago, and being able to even insert ads into those devices is important. Yeah. So like device reach will always be an important problem. I think there's nuances around, like you talked about data availability. Like data is different. Like, for example, Apple devices, there's constraints around privacy and tracking and GDPR stuff. On CTV devices, depending on the customer, whether it's, like a Tizen Samsung device or LG or, TCL device, there's, consent strings on whether or not you can send viewer data and send the device data to the ad server. So, depending on, I think mobile and web in general devices have richer analytics, richer data, and CTV devices have less data, but the data is there depending on what privacy settings you have.
Yeah. I just kind of feel like, the the benefit of having your ability to like monitor the system and update in real time that you get through server-side ad insertion through MediaTailer is so valuable that like I think it's worth moving away from client-side ad insertion just for that alone, right? And like even with our customers, like on the web, where like you guys should probably think about doing server-guided, stitched ads because it just gives you you can look across all of your devices and everywhere you're streaming and actually have that like single layer of control. It's just too many devices to do it independently, individually, all over the place.
That's right.
Yeah. Oh shoot. Ran out of time.
Time?
Yeah. I think we got to cut it. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody.